What is up, guys? This is Ben Raditz back in my new filming office, studio, whatever you want to call it. There's been a lot of new cameras coming out in the last few weeks. We've got the Canon R5, A7S III, the Blackmagic Ursa 12K, the Red Komodo is kind of out, but still kind of not. It's in beta mode. I think the Canon C500 Mark II or III is out as well. So with all these cameras coming out, you may be starting to wonder, as a filmmaker, do I need something more like this, which is like a handheld, mirrorless DSLR kind of camera? Or do I need to go with a huge cinema camera like this? This is the Sony FS7 Mark I. Since we have these two fairly distinct separations in the video camera world, where it's more like a photo camera on this size and then more like a massive camcorder on this end, when your budget starts growing, you might start wondering which one's better for you. And if you have cameras like this that shoot fairly similar or the same resolutions, why would you spend $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 or even more than $10,000 on a camera like this when you could spend like $1,000 or $2,000 on a camera like this for the same resolution? So what actually goes into the body here that can't fit into this little guy? Because this guy can film 4K, can film 120 frames per second at 1080, but it can also shoot photos, which this guy can't. So off the top, it already seems like this is an A6500, so it already feels like this guy is winning over this guy. It also has built-in flash, a viewfinder, and a display, whereas this guy only has the display. And overall, it's just tiny. Like, you can almost carry this in your pocket if you really wanted to. Like, almost carry it in your pocket, close enough. Whereas with this guy, you like, good luck getting this into your backpack, let alone a whole suitcase. So this is actually a more built-up model than the base. We actually have a little backpack on the FS7 that holds a bigger battery and has some extra little inputs and outputs. And then on the bottom we also have a shoulder strap that comes with this external handle like this. So if we wanted to be shooting for a long time, we can film like this. Look at the viewfinder, control our focus. This is actually pretty ergonomic to carry around for a long time. Look at that. Do my focus, do my zoom, do my iris, control my zoom down here, press record down here, and then the whole time I'm just watching on the screen. Nice and easy, can carry it with one hand. It's not bad like this, but the space is a little bit too hard for me to take off for this video, so I'm just gonna leave it like this. So looking at this guy, you can already tell that there's many, many more accessible functions on the outside than there is for this. Here we have a little wheel, a few buttons, 2 more wheels on the top, your shutter button, and that's more or less the extent of it. Everything else is inside of the touchscreen menu on this camera. On the bottom we have a small battery, and then 1 card slot for a standard SD card slot. On the side we have a micro USB port, a micro or mini HDMI, I think it's micro, and then a mic input. It doesn't even have headphone audio out for monitoring. Some other cameras do, like the A7 series, but not this little A6 series. Then we move over to this guy. Think of a camera function just in your mind right now. This guy probably has it. Let's start off with the ports on this camera. We have many more mounting points. The top I think has 6 or 8 threaded holes on the top, which is where we connect this handle on top. We have two full-size XLR ports, which is massive for a camera. It's also got this handy little holder for a shotgun mic here, and a hot shoe plate right beside it. We have not one, but two SDI outputs down here. So SDI is another video cable source similar to HDMI, but SDI I think is a little bit more reliable. Along with the SDI ports, it also has an HDMI port, so you really have a lot of flexibility when it comes to external recording, external viewing. Like if you had a small HD monitor, for example, you could plug it into the HDMI source. Then on the back we have this big cavern for the massive batteries that it can handle, and a little DC port here for direct power in, which is super handy if you're filming in one spot for a long time, similar to how I have my camera set up right now. I just have it plugged into the wall so I don't have to worry about my batteries dying out. Next up over here we have headphone out. And then down here we have two ports for not an SD card, but it's a XQD memory card, and I think Sony makes them themselves. So there's two ports for this guy. Plug this guy in here, so now we have two in here. And then on the top we have a big multi-cable connection. So that's actually how this backpack plugs in and connects to the camera. I think there's many different connections that pass through here. I'm not too sure of the exact pinout. And then that brings us to this side here. Basically you can control the whole camera from this menu button system while going through the menus on the viewfinder. Here we have a little panel for mic gain control. Underneath that we have some buttons for slot select, so that's where you can choose which XQC card, XQD card, XQD memory card, XQD memory card. SD card is so much easier to say. So you can choose which slot you're recording to with this button. And then below that we have a menu button with this little wheel that also acts as an enter button when you push in. A few more buttons of some other controls. A gigantic silver recording button so you don't miss it here. There's also a record button way on top beside the zoom rocker. And then we come to this little silver knob here, so that can turn completely around. And it makes a noise, so you might be wondering what that noise is for. This is for an internal ND filter. So it has 3 different presets that you might be able to change if you open up the body, but I'm not sure if I would recommend you doing that. It's got a clear, a quarter, 1/16th, and 1/64th ND filters. So that gives you a lot of play in terms of the amount of darkness that you want to add to the sensor. Speaking of the sensor, it's hidden away behind this massive lens, and it is quite a nice looking sensor. But this is a super 35mm sensor, whereas this is a much smaller APS-C sensor. The funny thing about these two sensor sizes is that they're more or less the same in terms of the amount of crop with your lenses. So if I really wanted to, I could use this tiny little lens on this giant body and this giant lens on this tiny little body. So let's just do that for the fun of it. Something doesn't look right here, but I mean, they both work. I can turn this camera on. This actually looks pretty good. This is a G series lens from Sony. This is super wide at 16mm all the way up to 50. You know what, let's just throw the whole thing together. Oh yeah, that's another thing I didn't mention. This backpack also has the capability of plugging in these very popular V-mount batteries right onto the back. At 16mm, I feel like I could almost vlog with this camera if it wasn't so heavy. I don't think I'd end up doing that, but if you really wanted to vlog on a $10,000 camera, Now that we know the differences in terms of the externals, before going into the internals, I'd start thinking about things like how portable you need your camera to be, because obviously one camera is more portable than the other. How many inputs and outputs do you need? Do you need 2 full-size XLRs? Do you just need one little 3.5mm jack? Do you need to be filming for super long time? Like, I don't think this camera will overheat ever, maybe. Like, you can see that it has some heat dissipation here. It actually has an internal fan to keep it cool, so I think even if it starts getting warm, it's gonna start turning the fan on so that you can at least keep recording. Maybe you get a little bit of fan noise inside the video, but it's a lot better than having a record limit or having your camera overheat like the RF5. You'll also want to think about how you're going to be holding these cameras. So obviously this camera isn't going to fit on a Ronin S, for example, whereas this camera easily fits on one. It could fit on even smaller of a gimbal if you really wanted to. If you want to be shooting photos with this camera, the FS7, the cinema cameras, those are out. Whereas these guys, they can shoot RAW. They're meant to be shooting photos as well as video. So that's why I really like my A6500. So despite all the differences between these two cameras, is it really worth 6 times the price to go from a photo and video capable camera with 4K, 120 frames per second at 1080p, internal stabilization, just to go up to a camera with a lot of ports? The external differences is one thing, but then you come into the internals and that's where things start getting a little bit different. Obviously, with more audio channels, you're gonna need a bit more processing. You got more space that's needed for these ND filters. You have a lot more options for external recording and external monitoring, so you need a bit more space to output all of these video sources. You need a bigger battery, so you're gonna need more space for that. With all the obvious extras that it needs for all this extra processing and hardware capabilities, these bigger cameras also come with much better image processing. Obviously, there's a real big limit to how much you can fit inside of a camera this small. The thing about these cameras is that they would rather put more processing inside of a camera than worry about the size of the camera. It's a little bit more of the opposite when you come to these smaller cameras. B&H did a very good comparison between the FS7 and the A7 photo and video camera, so that's a little bit better than what my camera is, but it's still a very good comparison, comparing a big cinema video camera to a smaller mirrorless SLR photo video camera like this. I'll link it in the description as well, because I think if you really want to know more about this, it's a really good article to read about the differences and the similarities, and they also provide some really good images with the comparison between the processing between each camera. One big difference between these two cameras when it comes to video capabilities is the codec that it records to. Obviously, with a smaller camera with smaller SD cards, you're going to need a bit more compression for the video that you film. So this camera writes to XAVC-S or XAVC-S HD for non-4K video. That gets compressed all the way down to maximum 100 megabits per second. You also have the option to select a bit more compression, like 50 megabits per second, to allow you to get a little bit more video in your SD card. This camera can shoot XAVC Intra, which goes all the way up to 600 megabits per second when you're shooting 4K at up to 60 frames per second. Without talking too specifically about this camera, most of these bigger video-only cameras, they also come with a bit more codecs that they can write to that offer a lot less compression. Things like the Blackmagic RAW or C-RAW on Canon or Z-RAW on the Z-Cam. You've also got Apple ProRes. You also have XAVC Intra like this guy. So with these bigger cameras, you're often going a little bit more towards much better image quality than you are for more compression for smaller file sizes. These smaller mirrorless cameras, however, go for a little bit of a mix between the two. They go for decent size video compression and decent image quality. So you kind of get the best of both worlds for this guy with a little bit more limitations, whereas you get a lot more flexibility with where you record to on these bigger cameras. As I said before, this camera specifically has a fan and internal cooling. That's another bonus for these bigger cameras, is that you can implement more cooling systems inside of these to be able to increase your recording limits. Smaller cameras like this guy, they're very limited for how much cooling they have. The best they have is basically the materials that they make them with. So I think the magnesium alloy that they make most of these cameras with is pretty good for heat dissipation, and they have a few copper plates to move the heat around on the inside, but you definitely can't fit a good fan and air cooling system inside of a small camera like this. Another reason you might want to get one of these bigger video cameras is for the dynamic range. Smaller mirrorless cameras are notorious for having pretty poor or at least mediocre dynamic range. So basically, dynamic range is when you have an image that has one really bright area and one really dark area. A good dynamic range will be able to pull the highlights out of the really bright areas while keeping the shadows in the dark area all well exposed and sharp without having anything blown out on either end of the luminance spectrum. I'm not too sure of the exact specifics about how different cameras process the dynamic ranges, but what I do know is that mirrorless cameras haven't been great. They're getting a little bit better, but they're still not the best that they can be. Whereas these bigger video cameras, they've been good at it, they're still good at it, they're continuing to improve, but this is one area that they really shine in. And you can see that in the B&H article that I'm throwing in the description, because they put side-by-side images from the FS7 and the A7 cameras. And I think every single time the FS7 wins over those cameras. Another reason why you might go with one of these bigger professional cinema cameras, professional video cameras, professional camcorders, one of these big cameras, is that basically any sort of number that you'll be inputting for recording video, like the shutter speed, ISO, or the white balance, you're usually going to get a little bit more of a boost on the far ends of the spectrum on these cameras than you will on these. These numbers are usually a little bit more restricted, possibly because they know the limit of the camera, and these cameras can do a little bit more. But things like shutter speed, you'll be able to go slightly lower or slightly higher when you're shooting video. Things like white balance, for example, I know this camera is maxed out at around 10,000 Kelvin at the far high end, whereas this camera can go all the way up to 50,000. So clearly you have a lot more play with where you go from this, and it also goes lower at 1500 versus 2500 on the smaller camera. And that goes for other specs as well. Now, one area that the smaller mirrorless cameras may have a little bit of a bonus on over these bigger professional cameras is the autofocus. Typically, a lot of people, when they're using these bigger cameras, a lot of the times they'll either be focusing themselves or they'll have a complete remote system with a focus puller to do all the focusing for them. So while this camera does have autofocus, I don't really think Sony put as much attention to detail into the autofocus system on this camera as they would for this camera, because this camera is aimed a little bit more towards the amateur than this guy. A lot of the times people with this camera might just want to point, shoot, rack the focus with your shutter button and then start filming. Whereas cameras like this, you'll often have a full setup, you'll have your focus already figured out, but that might just be because this camera is a little bit older than this one. I know that the new Canon C500 came out with really good autofocus according to Gene at Potato Jet. That was a really good video by him as well, so I would recommend going to that one as well. Apart from going too much more into detail about these two specific cameras, I'll just finish off by saying that if you're still stuck between this one, or you're just still wondering as a fan of cameras in general, the biggest reason why you would go for something like this is obviously the price. I mean, $1,500 versus $10,000 for both having 4K. It's almost a no-brainer to go with something like this. You're also getting a lot more convenience with this. You're getting the capability to shoot photos. So someone like me who's really big into photography as well as videography, who doesn't necessarily have a full-size studio budget to go and purchase something like this, this makes a lot more sense. If you're buying something like this, you're not too worried about the price as much as you were if you're buying something like this. You're also not worried about the form factor and the convenience and portability of something like this. You're also looking at a little bit better of an image, whether that be the codec that you're writing to, the internal image processing of the camera, could be more fine audio control with the 2 knobs and the 2 XLR inputs, could be the bigger battery and the DC input for extended recording times, or you just want a big camera for the sake of compensation. Now, these bigger professional cameras don't only come this big all the time. Obviously, this is one of Sony's bigger cameras. But Sony also makes the FS7, which, if you compare the two, makes a lot more sense to get something like this. The body itself is fairly similar to the size of the new Red Komodo, maybe a little bit longer. For shooting, it makes a lot more sense to hold something like this. You have your hand grip on one side, you're pulling focus on the other hand, looking down at the monitor, and it has a very similar button system as the FS7. So this one will run you around $5,000 to $6,000 versus this where it's $9,000 or $10,000. So the FS7 may run you sort of between the two of these extremes, while giving you probably closer quality to the FS7 than a small mirrorless camera. That is basically the big differences between a small mirrorless camera and 2 of these bigger professional cinema cameras, professional camcorders, whatever you want to call these big cameras. I'm currently filming on this guy, the FS7. Most of my videos so far on this channel have been with this guy here. I've had this for just about a full year and I'm still loving it. I may actually have to do a little review on it because it has done me a lot of good over the past year, and hopefully it'll keep lasting for the next few years if I don't replace it with something new. Man, all those new cameras are looking real tasty these days. Anyways, time for me to head back and edit my other videos. Maybe I'll start filming something new sometime soon, but all this to be said, go find a camera that you really want. Don't just buy it because it's big, don't just buy it because it's expensive. Do a lot of research before buying a camera. While the specs of these new cameras coming out look real good, do a bit more research just to make sure that what you're getting is actually what you're gonna be needing, because not everyone's gonna need 8K from a Canon R5. Not everyone's gonna need super high frame rate at 4K with the new A7S III. And a lot of people aren't gonna be needing the 12K from the new Blackmagic video camera. I'll be sticking with my 4K in my A6500. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.